This is Talkish. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Talkish is available at hallicasserjayne.com. This week on Talkish, some good old-fashioned conversation that takes us back to America's past and brings us forward to America's culinary future. When joining me at my table is up first, Carolyn Fraser, the author of Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the book just named by the New York Times one of the best 10 books of 2017. And at the bottom of the hour, Susi Gott Séguret. Her book, Appalachian Appetite, Recipes from the Heart of America, at long last brings Appalachian food from its longtime cocoon of stereotypes into the 21st century. It's time for Talkish. Let's get to it. Who doesn't love the Little House on the Prairie books, the works of Laura Ingalls Wilder? To millions worldwide, the warm and loving portrayal of Wilder and her family in the books and the wonderful television series has been a source of inspiration. Born 150 years ago this year, in 1867, Laura Ingalls Wilder was the real-life pioneer girl who survived wildfires, tornadoes, malaria, blizzards, and near starvation on the Great Plains in the late 1800s, who later in life became a best-selling author. Her books have sold over 60 million copies in 45 languages. The TV show of the 1970s and 1980s is one of the longest-running, most popular shows in television history, and is still in syndication. Adaptions in print, on stage, and on screen have followed the book's original publication, as have songbooks, cookbooks, sequels, chat sites, and merchandise of all kinds, from dolls to sunbonnets. But how accurate have the portrayals of Ingalls Wilder been, even her own? Now comes a new look at Laura Ingalls Wilder, her life, her truth, in the book Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. The author is Carolyn Fraser, the editor of the Library of America edition of the Little House series, who claims in this new biography that the true life of Laura Ingalls Wilder has never been told before. It's time for Talkish. Let's talk with author Carolyn Fraser. So let's get going, because I got a short amount of time and I have a lot of questions for you. I just think you did a wonderful job on this. Congratulations, by the way. The reviews of Prairie Fires have just been wonderful. And the book, just named by the New York Times, one of the 10 best books of 2017. You must be out of your mind, thrilled to death. Wow. That's pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
That feels good.
It was a real honor, and it's really nice to see your work recognized in that way.
Absolutely. So start with me about this. How did your own love of Laura Ingalls Wilder begin?
Well, I started, like everybody else, as a fan of the books. I read them as a kid and just loved the whole series. I read them over and over again. And through my grandmother, I really had kind of a sense that these were, in part, kind of expressive of my own past, because all of my ancestors were immigrant farmers in the Midwest. So it was really, I felt quite drawn to them because they seemed to be a kind of a pathway to the past. And I think a lot of people feel the same way about them.
Absolutely. No question about it. We're going to explore later in more depth, but the title of the book is Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Why fires? Why dreams?
Well, prairie fires are something that Laura experienced directly and literally. She even has a chapter in Little House on the Prairie called Prairie Fire about the time when a fire came sweeping across the Kansas plains and was one of those kind of terrifying experiences that the settlers had. But I think that over the course of the book, it becomes a kind of metaphor for not only the difficult relationship that she had with her daughter in creating these books, but also for the really extraordinary political controversies that raged about the New Deal and all of the things that were happening when Wilder was writing these books.
Okay, and dreams?
And the dreams are something that she wrote about quite often. She defined this for her readers in various speeches that she gave. She talked about the values that her parents had, about this dream of establishing a successful farm. And that, I think, is a very complicated thing in both her life and her work, because we see how difficult and indeed virtually impossible it was for her father and for herself, along with her husband Almanzo, to establish that kind of successful farm. Farming was incredibly difficult for these very small, undercapitalized farmers, and once they got out onto the Great Plains in an area that was semi-arid, they really had no hope of establishing successful farms without irrigation.
Okay, she's a source of inspiration. Many a young girl, boy. She's been emblematic of everything America stands for in her way, right? Has her position as the poster girl for the great American spirit been a lie? Curated not by herself, but partially maybe by herself, her daughter, which we'll talk about in a minute, but by two men. Talk to me about that, because I know you went into this, maybe in a way, trying to get to her truth. Not in a way, trying to get to her truth, which may be different from our inspiration. That's my point.
Yeah. I would never describe it as a lie. I think that Wilder was, in writing the Little House books, really trying to memorialize her parents. She said this again and again, and I take her at her word. She loved her parents unreservedly, her father especially, who I think she really took after in many ways. She had that same sort of drive and adventurous quality, and she just loved him. I think she inherited that great gift for storytelling from him and his love of music. But I think that in her desire to memorialize her father, she created a picture of him that was appropriate for children, but it was in certain ways a little bit sanitized, because she left out a lot of things that did not reflect well on him. And this is, people often ask how accurate the Little House books are. They are very accurate in many particulars, but she also left out a lot of things that would have made the picture of him more complicated and shown people that he wasn't the greatest farmer in the world, that he wasn't the greatest businessman, that he didn't always have, sort of perfect instincts about where to go and how to protect his family. So when we read the Little House books, I think we have to realize that we're seeing a somewhat sunnier portrait than was accurate. And this, of course, is an issue with all autobiographies in a way, but we also have to remember that her books were published as novels. So she had the right to fictionalize, but the funny thing was that she and her daughter Rose, who helped her in many ways with the creation of the Little House books, would in later years claim that the novels were true in every particular, which of course they weren't. So this, I think, brings up this whole notion of what is fact, what is fiction, and what did she believe she was doing.
Right, which is, you could go down 1,000 rat holes on all of this, because it is fascinating. You wonder partly how she, as a woman, she was in her 60s when she wrote the books. For that time, that certainly was not young, as we might consider, 60 the new middle age today. But I'm curious as to how she actually saw her own life, her own parents. And we'll never really know that in one sense, because we all have our own inner pictures of our moms, our dads, our family, and how they might come out years later. Who knows? Talk about her spirit. This is interesting to me as well, Carolyn. I read those books 1,000 years ago, and over and over and over and over and over again. And all of that is colored now by the TV series, which also was so much a part of my life and most everybody's life who's been around.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if we confuse her with the character that was played on the TV show now, because a lot of us haven't gone back and read the books in so many years. Talk to me about that. Was she a spirited girl? Was she a shiny apple? Was she a good girl? Was she mischievous, which, she was so well? Talk to me about who you think she was after all your research.
Sure. Well, I think, she told us she wrote this memoir which preceded the Little House books called Pioneer Girl, which was published to great acclaim a few years ago for the first time. So I think in many ways that image of her from the show is not inaccurate. She was a very spirited girl. She did have a lot of adventurousness and mischievousness. That comes through very clearly in the memoir, which is very closely related to many scenes in the books. The scene where she teases Nellie and tempts her into going into the creek and all of that. A lot of these things actually happened much as she described them in the book. So I think that her character as she presents it in the books is not fictitious. One of the interesting things that occurs both in the memoir and in her books is this true thing that happened where in school she was asked to write an essay, and she wrote a little essay called Ambition. And ambitious is what she really was all her life. That essay really defined her character in many ways, that she was not somebody who was content to just accept things as they were, but whatever she was given, and she was presented with many tragedies and failures and disappointments early on in life, she would take those things and do her utmost to turn things around.
Yeah, fascinating. And she also never gave up. This fast. I had no idea about her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. None. Wow. So she had, oh my gosh. She has two children. One dies. It was a son, I remember, right? Who died very young, like a few days after he was born. And then there's Rose. This is something that I was dying to ask you about. So here we go. Because this is a girl who had such a wonderful relationship with her own parents. And and we generally, we learn from our parents. Yet she had a very difficult relationship with her daughter, Rose. Talk about that. Two very interesting women butting heads.
Yeah, and it is, a central irony of their lives, I think, that they had such a, tumultuous and difficult relationship, given that they went on to produce one of our classic and beloved fictional works about a warm and loving American family. So it is quite striking that they had such a tempestuous relationship. I've thought a lot about why that came to be, and I think a lot of things went into it, including possibly that, Laura became a mother very early in her life. I mean, she wasn't particularly young when she married by the standards of the day. She was 17 when she got engaged to Almanzo Wilder, and 18 when they got married and became a mother, shortly thereafter. And I think that may have been part of what was so difficult for Rose growing up, is that all these tragedies that the Wilders experienced in the first 4 years of their marriage, the loss of the little son, the crop failures, the deaths, Almanzo's illness in particular. He was partially paralyzed by a very severe bout of diphtheria, and then they lost their home to fire. And, Rose was very young when all of this was happening, but she was old enough to have experienced it. And I think that those tragedies stayed with her in ways that she never quite got over. And you see this in her later life. She is constantly building and renovating houses in a kind of compulsive way, and even builds a very expensive home for her parents, which, in many respects they may not have even wanted. So there is something a little compulsive about her behavior, which I think we can only trace back to her earliest experiences.
Right, and everybody's life is so different, and the things that happen, and the attention that we sometimes are forced to give others that we can't give maybe to the one who might need it at that time. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Myth-making, myth-busting. I want to go back to that because, I was doing research on all of this for this conversation that we're going to have besides reading the book. And, you read all sorts of things. I know you're like me, a conservationist. I'm actually a farm girl. So I get all where Laura was, which is when I was reading it, by the way, was on my farm. So the thing that I'm curious about is we have to be so politically correct these days. This girl, after all, was the daughter of settlers, white settlers, the Homestead Act. They went out. They did what the government was allowing them to do. Hindsight is 20/20, and then there's a lot of stuff that I've read about, they took the land from the Native Americans. This annoys me. This woman truly is a national treasure, right? I think so. I imagine you do too. And when we get into this politically correct and how we look back on the lives of somebody of such enormous gift to us, whether it was embellished or it wasn't, doesn't really matter. It caught the fever of the generation. How do you feel about that?
Well, of course, it's impossible to step outside of our own time when we consider the works from the past. I mean, virtually everything written during the 19th century and much of the 20th, we have to reevaluate in light of what we now know and now understand about the Native American experience. But I actually think that that's one of the things that's so fascinating about the Little House books, which on their face, are racist and include stereotypes. None of the Indians in Little House on the Prairie, for example, are characters. I would define them as caricatures. But what that book does for us in terms of opening up what the white settlers were thinking when they did what they did is really, I think, invaluable now, because otherwise we wouldn't know as viscerally what was happening in their minds, in their attitudes, in their beliefs that led them to do what they did. And I think that it's one thing to study in school a concept like manifest destiny, which is this idea that white settlers were meant by Providence to spread out across the West and do something useful with it. And it's another thing to read the Little House books and discover, what they were actually feeling and what the sources of their fears were and where those stereotypes came from. And this, to me, was one of the most fascinating aspects of editing the text of the books for the Library of America, was to discover what it was that Wilder knew about an event she called the Minnesota Massacre, which is now known as the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. That, to me, is a defining moment in the books where she is expressing her childish fears of Indians at the same time as also expressing this sense of divine right in taking over their land. So it's just an invaluable text that I think does for settlement something of what Twain did in Huckleberry Finn in describing how whites thought about slavery at the time. So it's really, I think, just an invaluable work.
I had to bring that up because, in these days of political correctness, need I say, there are those who say take them out of the book schools, take them out of this, that, and the libraries, and I'm like, are you kidding me? These are our treasures.
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever advocate for censorship, but I think that if you are going to teach the Little House books now, you do have to teach them in a sensitive way and with the appropriate historical context.
Absolutely.
And I think that they probably are being taught, but in a very, very different way, and possibly to different age groups, and that strikes me as totally appropriate.
And I totally agree with that. I guess to play the devil's advocate, the other side of the coin would have to be there's just pure joy in those books on so many levels. That should never be censored either. I'm not sure families can have that kind of joy today. We all grow up in such different ways these days than they did back in the day. You did an amazing amount of research. I mean, the back of the book, almost 3/4 of the book is notes. God, girl, how long did it take you to write this, by the way?
Well, I worked on it for, in terms of the writing, for about 4 or 5 years, but the research went on for longer than that because I did have this opportunity to do that research for the Library of America, and that made a big difference in terms of kind of giving me a head start. And
I just want to say that knowing that all those notes are in the back of the book, one might say, I'm not going to pick that up. Oh, my God. This is so eminently readable. It's delicious. It is absolutely delicious.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that.
I mean, my best friend is yelling at me because I have a copy, and she said, "When are you going to be finished? When are you going to be finished?" And I'm savoring every last second of it. I'm not rushing through like sometimes I do for interviews. I said, no, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait. And I said, Christmas, maybe Christmas, you'll get it, but you can't take it far. It is a treasure, just like the books that I'll put on I still have my original books, so I'll put it up there with that. Listen to me also that I want to talk to you about all of this research that you did, though, unpublished manuscripts, letters, diaries, land and financial records. Talk to me about this. What's the thing that surprised you most? I mean, I'm hoping you had a great, oh my gosh, moment as a gift in all of this research and writing you did.
Yeah, I mean, I was familiar with the general outline of Laura's life and Rose's, but the thing that I really was startled to discover was Rose's connection to yellow journalism in San Francisco, how she got her start in working for the San Francisco Bulletin and for a guy who was a friend of William Randolph Hearst. And that is so fascinating to look at in terms of what happened with the Little House books, because it's this marriage of fact and fiction that I'm not sure would have happened in quite the same way if she hadn't had that early inculcation in the sort of crazy stuff she did in San Francisco, which involved, kind of making up autobiographies for people like Charlie Chaplin. So she had quite the imagination.
I tell you, what a character.
And really just, she just didn't have any boundaries.
I kind of liked her. She was friends with Ayn Rand, right? Rose and libertarian.
Yeah, I don't think that she did meet Ayn Rand once, and they did write to each other for a period. I don't think she was real good friends with Rand, but the two of them and this other woman who isn't as well known now, Isabel Patterson, are together considered sort of the three mothers of the libertarian movement. And it's real interesting to look at sort of a few little moments in the Little House books where those ideas and that philosophy crop up.
I find that fascinating. And hated FDR?
Yes, and that too is just an extraordinary moment when both Laura and Rose were so disgusted by the New Deal and all the projects and interference by federal agents who are coming into their community and telling farmers what to do. That is an extraordinary moment in both of their lives where they kind of really turn on the federal government. That had been present, I think, in Laura's life before, because I think she, through her father, was aware of how unfairly farmers were treated in many instances, but it really hardens into something quite visceral in the 1930s. And to look at their letters about FDR and Truman, who they also strongly disapproved of, is kind of a lesson in where our current rhetoric comes from, because it's so similar. It's really astonishing to see that all of this that we're currently going through had its start in the 1930s.
So absolutely, which makes this even more compelling a read when you start to see how it all, that part of it, because it's a strong part of their lives, and there, but you get that farm spirit thing. I totally get that other side of it. I mean, you can't fight for achievement against Mother Nature and everything else that was going on in her back in the day, and not appreciate where they got to. There were rumors that Laura didn't write the Little House books, that Rose did. You want to talk to that for a second?
Yeah, I really, strongly take exception to that, because we have the handwritten manuscripts that Laura produced. And so she really wrote the books. Rose did play an enormous role in shaping them, in editing them, and revising them. And she's probably should be credited with the fact that they were published at all, because it was her connections and her professional relationships with agents and editors that helped this happen. But on the other hand, I would point people back to the original manuscripts that Laura produced, which are so amazing to study and full of extraordinary scenes and writing and dramatic moments. They're well worth studying just on their own. And, it's really Laura's voice that comes through most strongly in the Little House books.
I think what really comes through and above and beyond her voice is her heart, which you get the feeling Rose didn't quite have that same sunshine heart, if you will. But I'll tell you, she had a sense of business that Rose. Oh my God! I mean, she's doing great on the internet today. It's just the ultimate brander. I mean, she'd be an influencer.
And she was an incredible. She was an incredible hard worker herself.
Yeah.
I mean, the enormous amounts of time and energy that both women put into it is just nothing short of remarkable.
Absolutely. The ups, the downs, the deaths, the pain, the struggle, all of that is so intertwined in her life. Bankruptcy, like the rest of the world, and the big crash and what have you. But damn if she didn't torpedo ahead, that Laura, and ultimately was successful. But she died in 1957 on her Missouri farm. For all intent and purposes, her life was successful. She leaves us with left quite a legacy of her own, whether real or in many ways imagined. I wonder, however, after all your research, what the real Laura Ingalls Wilder would want her legacy to be. Not what we want her legacy to be, but what would she have wanted the legacy to be, and did she at least get that?
Oh, absolutely. I think, she saw her books as her legacy. She saw that as her testament to, the love that her parents had for them and the closeness of the family that allowed them to survive these terrifying ordeals, whether it was the hard winter of the 1880s or these endless series of crop failures and Mary's illness and blindness. That was her legacy, I think, and she was, I think, profoundly proud of that and benefited enormously from that at the end of her life. I think she finally felt, in the end, secure financially, emotionally, intellectually. I think she did exactly what she set out to do. And her life is just an extraordinarily heroic testament to endurance and perseverance of a particularly female kind, in a way, of just, forcing yourself to go on no matter what happens and to continue to do work that may not seem rewarding at the time, but that ultimately becomes a real testament to your endurance and spirit.
I'll tell you, Carolyn, in these times, this is a book every woman should read, and every man as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great to talk to you.
I've been speaking with Carolyn Fraser. Her book, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. For more information on the writer, visit carolynfraser.net. You are listening to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Carolyn Fraser, the author of Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and Susi Gott Séguret, the author of Appalachian Delight, Recipes from the Heart of America. Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne. Post new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern at hallicasserjayne.com. Susi Gott Séguret has been intimately involved with food and flavor since, as a toddler, she first felt the burn of a radish just pulled from the soil, still speckled with black earth, and washed it down with a gulp of fresh spring water that flowed out from under a moonshine still. Susi's words, not mine. Founder and director of the Seasonal School of Culinary Arts, held in Asheville, North Carolina, Ithaca, New York, Sonoma, California, and Paris, France. Susi also orchestrates the Asheville Wine Experience and the Asheville Truffle Experience. Originally from Appalachia, Susi honed her culinary skills in France, where she resided for over 20 years, earning a diploma in Gastronomy and Taste from the Cordon Bleu and the Université de Reims. Her articles, reviews, and photos have appeared in numerous publications and dozens of cookbooks. Her book, Appalachian Appetite, Recipes from the Heart of America, with a foreword by James Beard award-winning cookbook author and culinary icon Nathalie Dupree, at long last brings Appalachian food from its longtime cocoon of stereotypes into the 21st century. It's time for Talkish. Let's talk with Susi Gott Séguret. Susi, let's start our conversation with a look at your beginnings, because what a story you tell in the beginning of this wonderful book, Appalachian Appetite. Appalachian. You and I had a conversation off air about the correct saying of the word, which comes in many forms, and we've decided on, say it again, Appalachia. It's Friday.
And didn't throw an Appalachia.
Thank you, darling. Here we go. But talk to me about your parents, how they got to living down there, and what you gleaned from that very lucky experience of yours of growing up as you did. And it's not the wilds of Appalachia, as people think, but the beauty of. Talk to me.
Okay, well, it's a long story that I will try to make very short for our purposes. I feel incredibly fortunate to have been born in Appalachia, although not of Appalachian parents. So in a way, I have that duality that I've lived with all my life of being from here but not of here in 100% the same way that my colleagues and neighbors were. My parents were both raised in the North. Mom in Ithaca, New York. Her father was Dean of Men at Cornell for many years, and so she had a pretty sorority-type upbringing, and she never felt like that was her life. She was always a rebel, and my father was raised outside of Philadelphia by an engineer, Yale graduate, and father, and he also felt that that was not his life. He just wanted to live out in the woods like the Indians. So when they met, folk dancing, actually, it's a longer story than that. It involved asking permission of the Dean of Men to climb the library tower, which was then refused, and the story getting around to my mother, and she said, that's the man for me. And then they eloped and went down to Appalachia because they heard that the best music came from the North Carolina mountains, and they looked on the map to see where the highest mountains were, and they pinpointed Asheville. They ended up an hour north of Asheville in the wilds of Madison County, and they've been there ever since, and this was in 1960.
I won't say hippies. I don't know if they were hippies, but they were certainly unusual people. And I think, you know what, you can feel them in the cookbook. You really can. It's extraordinary, and it certainly has seeped into your life. But you led a really interesting life, too, because you left all of that, lived in Paris. What, 20 years, was it?
20 years in France, actually an hour south of Paris. So same kind of duality in a way. I lived in a tiny village of 200 people, 100 kilometers south of Paris. And so my children were born all in France, but they were not really of France in the same sense that everyone else around them was, as a parallel to my upbringing, because they bopped back and forth between France and Appalachia and spoke English as well as French, and had a slightly different perspective on life. So I've spent a lot of years feeling somewhat out of place, but loving the places where I was at the same time. And Appalachia, despite the wonders of France, and I really loved living there, I missed the mountains like crazy. And this is where my heart is. So I'm glad as can be to be back in Appalachia after all this time.
I'm fascinated that you could do both, but I really relate to that too because I did the same thing. Let's define the region of Appalachia and the people who settled that region in a way that, what ways that adapted to the fruits of the land that they settled. Because specifically, I guess should ask you, what exactly is the Appalachian style cookery within the broader context of Southern style cooking?
Yes, well, if we start with your original question of defining Appalachia, there are a couple of different definitions. If you go with the Appalachian Regional Commission definition, I believe that's from Georgia to New York, essentially, and that is an economic definition. But essentially, the Appalachian chain, as defined by the mountain structure, starts down as far as Mississippi and goes up to Maine. You think of the Appalachian Trail, which ends at Mount Katahdin in Maine. So I definitely consider Appalachia reaching up that far. So that means that in a sense, Appalachia is as much northern as it is southern because half of that length of the Appalachian chain is above the Mason-Dixon line. And when you think of Appalachia, you tend to think of the Appalachian South. So this is interesting. In the larger definition of Appalachian cuisine, generally we associate it more with the Southern cooking style. And I would say that what sets apart Southern cooking and Appalachian cooking is, besides the geographical defining features such as mountainous products versus low country products. Obviously, Appalachia is a mountainous region, so we deal with more frost, and there are certain things that we don't have. We don't have the sea ingredients, of course, that you might find in South Carolina, low country. And we have a shorter growing season also. So Appalachia is defined partly by hardship that is born of this short growing season, hard winters, little finances. So Southern cuisine is often more lavish because the finances are more generous. Appalachian cuisine tends to be it tends to concentrate around making the most of very little. So often meat is less a main ingredient and more of an accent. Hog meat, of course, is used widely in just about everything, but it is not necessarily the center of the plate. You have bacon fat or various different offal pieces, and by that I mean OFFAL, which spice up a dish and bring the vegetables to light. So we draw somewhat on the Indian tradition as well. I mean, in particularly the Cherokee Indian tradition in my region of Appalachia, which of course is North Carolina, and do a lot of things with corned beans and squash because that's what there is.
Right. Having lived in Appalachia for much of my adult life, I know that there's a rhythm to the life in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Great Smokies. And you make that point that the recipes that you put together in this particular book, you put together, and I think this is great because of the season that you were doing in it, so it was spring. So, I get that, and actually that is the best time. But life there is tethered to those seasons, and it defines the appetite, so to speak. And I know you're interested in music as well. You play, right?
Right.
Big part of your life, and photography, which beautiful photographs in this book, by the way. You incorporate all of this into Appalachian Appetite, but I don't think that that's so unusual. I think that's the lifestyle there, no?
Yes, you really can't separate music from anything in Appalachia. It's a big part of who the people are and how they have traditionally unwound at the end of the day. And even today, with a more modern time and with the prevalence of TV and handheld devices, there is still a lot of live music. I'm lucky enough to live an hour north of Asheville. Asheville, of course, has become a mecca for anybody in the arts, music, and culinary business, or beer, or wine, or whatever. So I'm incredibly fortunate there. But even in the far reaches of Appalachia, there's a richness in the community and the role that music plays in bringing the community together, and the ballads that are sung and that have been collected here 100 years ago when Cecil Sharp came to the region and discovered so many of the folk singers and tried to document that. There are many tales that are told, and likewise, food seeps into the music as music seeps into the food. There are a lot of songs that are built around culinary ingredients, and that makes for quite humorous encounters sometimes.
Also great parties. Terrific parties. So let's talk ingredients that are distinctive to the food that here. And speak to us. Now, this is, if you're not lived there, and I'm going to say some things that people's eyes might roll if they haven't heard of it. On the other hand, I'll be the first to tell you some of this stuff is just to die for. Wonderful. Speak to us of coon and collards, leather breeches and ramps, May apples and moonshine. I speak to you of Appalachian food. You mentioned hog, certainly at the core of a lot of it. But did I paint the picture right with the ones that I chose to
Oh, sure. You've got it.
Yeah. Ramps.
So obviously there are some ingredients that we have that are more difficult to find in other parts of the country, such as ramps, morels, various other mushroom varieties. But the small varmints, they figure in too. And yes, there are recipes for coon, for groundhog, certainly for venison, for possum, and there is a possum recipe in the cookbook because I could. I had possums that were eating my eggs, and I had to do something with them. So by golly, I found out that you can treat them like rabbit, and they're just as delicious as rabbit. And anything that's sautéed in shallots and butter and then cooked slowly in white wine with herbs and spices is going to be good at the end of the day.
I remember the first time I had squirrel. But I also remember the first time that somebody was working for me asked me if he could get a groundhog on the property. I'll never forget that. And welcome to the world. But it's an extraordinary experience. It's so back to the earth. It's so clean. Is that a good word to use? It's clean living. I'm living in Florida these days, and I'm missing it horribly. You begin with a section. So reading all of this was like, maybe I ought to go back to the farm. A lot of the recipes are yours in the book, not all. How did you decide who and which recipes you were going to include?
Oh, well, obviously my ambitions were enormous in starting out, and there's only so much you can do in a certain amount of time with deadlines. So like the Appalachian housewives forever, I made do with what I had at my fingertips at the moment. So what got in the book were the recipes from the people who responded to me first, and I tried to give a slice of recipes from all up and down the Appalachian chain from Mississippi to Maine. So I have each state represented in some way. Obviously, there are more recipes from around Asheville because I could stop in on those people and extract them before my deadlines. But anyway, I was lucky enough to get quite a good slice of top chefs to contribute recipes such as our local William Disson, Mark Rosenstein, Joe Scully, Denny Trantham, several others, and some chefs from Virginia. And it's a good slice. Besides the restaurant chefs, I've got several home cooks, too, featured as one of our local musicians, Ralph Lewis, who unfortunately has left us since the cookbook came to light. So he's immortalized with his chicken and dumplings recipe there, and then several of his simple family recipes that kept his family and friends going throughout their years of being on the road and playing music.
So, Susie, you begin with a section called A Savory Start, Ramps, Grits, Morels, Scrapple. Oh, my God, do I love Scrapple. Will you send me some, please? I want some. And here's one that I love. Pickled pig trotter with roasted sunchokes, sarsaparilla, cream pie, nut butter, arugula, and crispy sumac. Now, sumac to me are the trees that grew in my fields that we could never kill. Is that
exactly.
Is that sumac? Talk to me. What's with the sumac?
That is sumac. And we're talking about stag's horn sumac here because the form of the berries looks like stag's horns sticking up into the sky. And they are small berries. They're red. And they can be dried and crumbled into a powder and rubbed into venison or whatever kind of meat that you're cooking with. And they can also be steeped like a tea, and they have a delightful pink lemonade flavor.
Really? I have never heard of that. That was the first time anybody had told me anything other than trash the damn things. You can't even burn them in the fire.
Well, that's the joy of Appalachia. We eat our weeds.
Oh, absolutely. And nothing better than weeds. I'll tell you another thing that's even better than weeds, though. And that's morel mushrooms. We talked about them briefly, but I want to talk about the magic of morels. They're magic, but not like in the, LSD sense.
Right.
They are magic in the taste of them. But I want to talk to you also this is a spring book, Hunt for Morels, and the absolute magic of the moment when a clump of morels reveal themselves. You talk about
obviously you've done that. You've been there and done that, right?
Every year, darling, for 30-something years.
So yes, it's like Easter and Christmas combined with knowing that you're going to have this amazing savory taste on your plate afterwards.
And they are. And what can you do with why are morels so different than every other mushroom?
Well, one thing is they look rather atrocious, which is why you can recognize them and be sure that you're eating a safe mushroom, so that's great. And they just have this incredible flavor that is more mushroomy than any mushroom that you can imagine if you grew up on supermarket mushrooms. So I like, they're kind of like truffles in that a little bit goes a long way, and you can really use them with poor man's food, which is fortunate because truffles are tremendously expensive. That's another story. But morels, they go really, really well with pasta, rice, and potatoes because you want to savor the full flavor of the mushroom and not compete with it with other strong-tasting ingredients.
Just love them, love them, love them. And as I said, and when the weather first breaks and you go poking around the woods looking for them, and they are magic. They just kind of appear sometimes, and you say, wow, look at that. I know I've seen that place before. They weren't there a minute ago. And then there they are. Here's another one. I had to go here with you. Possum pate. Oh, darling. Susi.
Okay, so the first trick is to kill the possum, and they have 9 lives. And we won't go into how I managed to get it in the pot. But once you get it in the pot, essentially you can treat it just like rabbit. And if you don't have possum, if you don't have rabbit, yes, you can use chicken. Maybe use some of the dark meat like the legs and see what you can do with that. One of the tricks is getting the glands. If you happen to have a possum, you want to make sure that you cut out the glands so that it doesn't have an overpowering possumy flavor, which you might like, but your guests might not be so crazy about. But then, just saute them in shallots and butter and pour on some white wine, add some thyme, add a few vegetables if you like, and if you cook it down for some time and the meat starts to fall off the bones, then you can pack it in a pate pot and cut it up and serve it cold.
Are these acquired tastes?
Are you asking if it's an acquired taste?
Yeah, no, I'm asking because, I'm trying to remember the first time I started, when I first moved there to West Virginia, which is where I lived, and these things started to show up, in my life or whatever. I took it, I was like, why aren't more people eating like this? But I wonder if it is an acquired taste, and I'm just adventurous because I've traveled the world and I've eaten things that nobody would even dream to eat. What do you think? Is it acquired or we passed that?
I think if somebody had this dish in front of them and didn't know it was possum, they would like it. So really the acquired part is how willing are you to go to great lengths to get a possum on your plate. It's easy to find chicken because somebody else has taken care of the dirty work.
I remember the first time I had ramps, and I remember the warning that came with the first time that I had ramps. And I just was like, all right, I'll try it. And, and what was the warning? The warning was you'll be eating them for 4 months after that. But they are just divine. How do you describe the flavor of a ramp? And explain to people what ramps are in case they don't know.
Sure. Well, ramps are essentially wild leeks. They grow in the woods. They particularly like steep hollers where it's a little bit moist near a stream, perhaps. And they're in the lily family. Well, they're in the onion family, which is in the lily family, and they look like lily leaves coming out of the leftover green wintry leaf cover in the forest. And they taste incredibly green, incredibly pungent, incredibly fresh. And they are hot. They bite you back. So it's kind of like a cross between garlic and leeks, perhaps, but even more fierce.
Yes, but not killing fierce. Kind of a nice fierce.
Right. It's not like ghost peppers.
Right. Exactly. One of the chapters in the book, From the Hen House, farm fresh eggs. We got to do a riff on the difference between eggs grown on a farm and eggs bought in the supermarket. You cannot explain this to people, not only in the color of the yolks, but talk to me, right? It's a completely different experience eating an egg that you grow from one of your own homegrown chickens than what we buy. But I want to tell you, I just came back from Europe, and their eggs are even better.
Well, yeah, part of it's the pleasure of going in the hen house, and it's Easter every day in the hen house. And particularly if you have Americanas or some of the chickens that lay various different colored eggs. So you've got blue eggs and dark brown shelled eggs and the lighter colored shells as well. And it's so gorgeous. So there's that great tactile pleasure. And then the shells themselves are hard. You got to whack them on something to get the meat out, so to speak. And then, you just want to eat them raw. You want to take them in your hands and smear them around and have fun with them.
It's true. Gardening, do I say, it's such a southern occupation, so much more understood, I think, than it is up north. But I want to talk to you about collards, which I grew up on because I had a housekeeper who used to make huge pots of them, and my mother would go hide from the smell. Me, I've been looking for greens all of my life. But my world was greens, ham hocks, red pepper. You come up with Susie's Jack Daniels infused collards. I love that. And I'm going to try that over Christmas.
All right. You use moonshine and bacon in anything or any kind of alcohol and bacon, and it just wakes people up. So I'll go from collards to beets because a lot of people love beets. I do not love beets. I grew up on, I had to eat beets, and we had good beets. They were nice little baby beets out of the garden, but to me they always tasted like dirt. And collards can sometimes taste a little like dirt too. But if you take your beets and you wrap them in bacon and soak them in bourbon and then saute them in butter, then you've got me on that.
I happen to love beets, and I love the taste of dirt. But here's one that surprised me in the book. Wonderful story about your mother in this too. Nettle soup. And collecting. Yeah, so that's another one that, I'm terrified of stinging nettle, but talk about that. It's hilarious what you write, by the way.
Well, if you get gloves and go after them, you're safe, and when you cook them down, they lose their sting. The trick is they tend to harbor a lot of creatures, and so my mother used to serve them up, and she wasn't one for washing the vegetables. She would just barely steam them down, and she left all the worms in them. She figured it was good protein for us. And crunching on worm heads was not my favorite activity. And also the texture of nettles can be a little bit like algae in your mouth as well. So when I moved to France, I discovered a nettle soup recipe. When I moved to France, I was living in a little bitty village of 200 people in a garden between two old stone barns that were from 700 and 500 years old. And all that was growing in my garden was nettles. So like the possum, I had to do something with them. And I learned that if you saute them with onions and potatoes in a broth and then you puree them and pour in some cream, nobody can tell that there are any worms left, and what's left is something delicious.
The first time my ex-husband's nephews came to town and we were going out there to pick some of this stuff, and my sister-in-law at the time was just absolutely horrified by everything that was going on. See, I get my due back. I talk about it on here, but I'll never forget because my neighbor who had she like Mother Goose with 14 kids, and the sister-in-law is talking about because I had them out there collecting nettles and things, and they're filthy. They're like, how do you stand it? And my neighbor says dirt makes them grow because her kids were huge and the others were little kids. Welcome to the world. You also talk about berries. One of my favorites that people don't understand, and if they're not from that neck of the woods, pawpaws. And what to do with pawpaws, which I love. I have a wonderful recipe you would probably love for pawpaw bread. But the berries, and I would either. I bet you didn't have this in the book, but we would even take mulberries and make pie from them. Oh yeah, which I adore. But here's you do take on trout, which I think is wonderful. In West Virginia, we've got our wonderful yellow trout. But in the interest of time, what do you see as definitively Appalachian? Would that be the sauces and the gravies, the biscuits, the cornbread, the desserts, or that staple of Southern living, sweet tea?
I would say it's the adventurousness. So whatever ingredients you have, if you treat them adventurously, that's the Appalachian spirit.
I like that
And
spirit.
so you can come up with all kinds of surprises. I mean, you can go outside all kinds of lines. And I think the future of Appalachian cooking and why it has become something that people go crazy about now, finally after all this time of being looked at as something perhaps backwards and not particularly interesting, I think what is great is that Appalachian chefs are daring. They're intrepid. They just do it. So I made the observation in the book that this is a modern-day parallel of the craze for Nordic cuisine, which when I saw all the hype that went on around that a couple of years back, I thought, well, that's just exactly what we've been doing in Appalachia all this time, and so, what's the big deal? But it's that simplicity and, again, the adventurous spirit of taking something like, when we're talking about Nordic cuisine, we might be talking about nettles and lichens and various things that grow in the sea that we don't have here, but here we do have the ingredients we find in the woods, like turkey's foot, which looks kind of like turkey's foot, and it's another one of those ingredients that's pungent and it kind of bites you back. If you dare to put that on a plate, you've got something that's different from anywhere else, and you can take people on an adventure just by what's presented.
What do you do for the holiday feast?
Me particularly?
Yeah. What are you doing this year for the holiday?
Since we're coming up on that, I would love to say I had a wild turkey to put in the oven. That hasn't happened yet, but it might. I have a couple legs of venison in the oven in the freezer that I will probably pull out, and might rub a few of those sumac berries on it and forage for a few greens that you can still find hidden in the forest even after the freezes have set in. This turkey's foot is one thing that I can still find after the freezes. And sometimes if I scrounge around in the garden, I get weeds that are edible even after the freezes as well.
Susie, it's a terrific book. I'm so glad that you did it. So important. I hope everybody goes out and buys it and gets adventurous. What a way to start a new year, a new adventure. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you, Halli.
I've been speaking with Susi Gott Séguret. Her book is Appalachian Appetite, Recipes from the Heart of America. For more information on Susi, the Seasonal School of Culinary Arts, the Asheville Truffle Experience, and more, visit schoolofculinaryarts.org. Thanks so much for tuning in to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec, LLC. Be sure to tune into Talkish Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, when new podcasts are posted at hallicasserjayne.com. Until next time, this is Halli Casser-Jayne.